Heavenly Father, we thank you so much that we have an opportunity to return and to gather together to study your word. And even though it's going to be a tough word for us to study, being Ecclesiastes, the only pessimistic Bible book that I know of, but yet your Spirit can teach us through the negative of life how we can be positive with you. So Lord, we individually have confessed sin. If we had any, we rebound it. Individually, we have asked you to fill us with your Spirit, be under your control. And now as we focus on Scripture, we ask that you would anoint this time, that I would speak properly and teach properly, and that we would all, as students of the Spirit of God, receive your teachings. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we are in Ecclesiastes. Again, sorry for this being sideways for you folks, but the recording will be fine for you. Ecclesiastes asking the question, the teacher, the preacher, Solomon, is asking the question, is there any meaning to life? And he comes up with a conclusion that it's all vanity, and that without God, there is no meaning to life. So with that as our premise, I want to do a little review. So first of all, Solomon's life experiences and experiment. Solomon is doing something really interesting in the book of Ecclesiastes. First of all, he, being the greatest man that ever lived around the area of wisdom and kingdom power and authority and wealth, his wealth was just so exceedingly abundantly above anything that we could ever think of, that it's hard for us to think of Solomon ever being depressed. And yet he got out of fellowship. And when you get out of fellowship with the Father, your life goes into the weeds and mess, and it's bad. But he had every human resource possible to exploit every possible means that humans can go through to satisfy their lives. So he went and decided to write this book because he learned a lot about what not to do. And he learned a lot when he was out of fellowship, and he wants us to learn without being out of fellowship so that we can learn what's happening here. So he's got a thesis. And his thesis, although it's hard for you to see this, I'm sorry, but maybe you can follow along the best you can. Solomon's thesis is that everything, no matter what it is, all under the sun is vanity. It's vapor. It's emptiness. Living life on human level is a weary go-around. Things repeat themselves over and over. Historically, it repeats itself. And he says that no matter what he tried, he was never satisfied. So he did a series of experiments. In chapters 1 and 2 is what we studied a couple weeks ago. And he figured out that there's no satisfaction. Instead, it leads to frustration and despair. And so what were those experiments? First of all, he has a thesis here in chapter 1, verse 12 through chapter 2, verse 26. And he does the following types of experiments. First of all, he looks at knowledge and wisdom. Being the man who was given wisdom by God, and now he's out of fellowship, he's now operating in human wisdom. We call that the natural man. Human wisdom and human knowledge. Now, he studied a lot. This man, he's a genius. And we don't normally realize that until you start to study all the things that he was an expert in, which is a long, long list. We're not going to go over it today, but if you like to have that list, every time I study something new from Solomon, I keep adding it to my list. He's a horticulture expert. He's architecture expert. The man is just a genius in multiple areas. And he says that the more you know, the more you're aware of that which you don't know. And so it leads to this feeling of, wow, there's no end to learning. There's no end to reading books if you're a book reader. There's no end, and so there's no final satisfaction. It's like you always got to get to the next one. You always got to go to the next one. He has that feeling, and that's the human knowledge side. And then the wisdom side is he gets sorrow. He gets sad because he realizes that no matter how much wisdom he has, he can't solve all the problems of the world. He can't solve all the problems in his own life. And when he falls out of fellowship, he definitely has trouble And we'll see that as we get further into chapter 3 now. So after knowledge and wisdom, it proved his point that all that's vanity, is vapor. He went on to say, okay, well, what about pleasure? Maybe I can get satisfied, happiness, through experimenting with pleasure. And so he found that there's no satisfaction in that mental realm, knowledge and wisdom. So now he's going into the realm of the physical and the sensual realm, is what I called it here. All right. So he did experiments in laughter. And in laughter, he did mirth and laughter, and he thought that, okay, if we have humor and comedy and we have a happiness attitude, maybe that can bring satisfaction. And he realized it doesn't last very long. It's hard to maintain that. So the next thing he went into is drugs. We call it wine, alcoholic beverages in Ecclesiastes, but it's drugs. And we see how mankind does the same thing. Can't find happiness, satisfaction. Oftentimes people experiment now with drugs to see what that would do for them. Well, he did the same thing. And here's the man who's supposed to be really wise. But he thought he could do it as an experiment. He would have full control over it. Yeah, right. You take in a lot of alcohol, you're not going to have full control. You're going to get to the point where you have no control. And he realized over time that, no, that didn't lead to happiness either. So he thought about, what about my labor? What about, doing something, doing it? And so he built incredible buildings, and he has multiple types of architectural buildings he did. There are aqueducts and other things that we're finding out that he was involved in, that his plans were. And I told you about the horticulture. He did horticulture experiments, different types of plants, flowers, food, all kinds of experiments. He thought by doing a lot of labor, he'd get satisfaction from that. Because, we oftentimes do. We feel pretty good about if we accomplish something. But then he realized eventually he's going to die, and all that's going to be passed on to somebody else who's not going to take care of it. And remember, his conclusion at the end of chapter 2 that we studied last time we met was he didn't want to give it over to some fool, one of his sons that was full. So he was not so sure about that. So then the last thing he experimented with that we have listing is grandeur and magnificence. His wealth and power, and having to be well known internationally. People came to him for lots of things, and he thought maybe that make him happy and satisfied. And then again he realized, no, at the end of all that, there's still an emptiness inside. There's still this vanity about life. So this is like summarizing what we've gone through already. So we have a conclusion, and so far that conclusion is, if you don't know God, every day you can try something new, the result will end in the same result. You'll be empty. It'll be vanity. You cannot take anything with you after you die. So if you don't have an eternity perspective, you only have now. If you think that, okay, there's no God, or you're not in any way following God's wisdom, you're doing it all by mankind's wisdom, there's an end to that. There's a death at the end. And he says, basically, you don't have any hope for an eternal blessing if you are following your own wisdom, knowledge, experiments. It's all vanity. And then basically you're completely spiritually barren. A spiritually barren person. What does that mean? Well, the Bible calls that spiritual death. You are separated from God, and you are not happy with life. And a lot of people don't know why they're not happy. It's because God's placed in their hearts eternity and seeking Him, and they don't understand that. So his conclusion so far in chapters 1 and 2 is leading to he needs to do something different. Well, he's got an experiment he's been doing. Now we're going to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and we're going to do verses 1 through 15. There's much more there, but 1 through 15 will kind of give us a good sense of what's happening. And in particular, Solomon has made some observations. So a little precursor here before we get into the verses. In chapter 3, we're getting Solomon's second report. His first report was that I did all these experiments and it led to a conclusion of vanity, vapor. Now he's going to make observations. He says, okay, if I can empirically test something out, empirical is how science works. Can you see it, taste it, touch it? Can you recreate it, make it repeat itself over? And so empirical evidence is the type of things that we look for in science. But empirical can't get to the hidden things. It doesn't detect spirituality. So he says, okay, how about observation now? So he's changing his view. He's now trying to see, by observing the life, what is man's position in the universe? That's what he's going to go for. Now you need to understand that Solomon wrote this. His life was from 1000 to about 970 BC. About 1,000 years before Jesus. Well, are you aware that Western civilization, the philosophies that started Western civilization from Greece, that on the western edge of Asia Minor, in a place called Miletus, they find the very first person ever as a philosopher of Greece to write philosophy. This is pre-Socrates. This is before Socrates. Well, look at the difference. Solomon is working on these philosophy hundreds and hundreds of years before the Western tradition of philosophy came into existence. All right? And we're going to see that, first of all, and in Western philosophy, if you take any philosophy classes, it all starts off with the world's in order. All the early philosophers said, okay, everything's got order to it, so therefore we can test it out, and we can build upon our knowledge. And they keep doing that over several hundreds and hundreds of years, and actually multiple thousands of years of philosophy until about the year 1890 or so. And then we circle back around with philosophers like Kant and Hegel, and they basically said, life is not worth it. So they circle all the way back around, all right? They're doing the same thing that Solomon has discovered in only his one lifetime, that they discovered in going through 3,000 years worth of philosophy. All right, so we're going to see that not only is Solomon a genius, but he's going to sum up all philosophies for us. And so we don't have to study all those other ones, unless you are curious or interested in philosophy, which I am, but I don't want to bore you with some of that human knowledge. We want to learn God's knowledge. All right, so we have a situation here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Let's go to verse 1. And verse 1 says the following: For everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under the sun, or under the heavens. For everything there is a season and a time for every purpose. This is the beginning of Solomon telling us the philosophy he's going to build on now. And that philosophy is that there's a time for everything. There's a purpose for everything. Everything that's under heaven, God has a purpose. He has a time for it. Now, I'm interested in these two key words, because when he starts his philosophy, he starts it off with the word purpose. For everything there's a season, a time for every purpose. So the word here for purpose shows that there is a design. Do you realize without there being order, without there being a design, we can't do science? There is no science when things are not in order, when the laws are not consistently present, when the natural laws like gravity is not present. If it was chaotic and you couldn't predict what was going to happen next, you would have a frustrated scientist, because you need to have order in order for us to do our experiments and observations. Same thing happens in medicine. There needs to be order. The body works a particular way. When you learn how it works, you can learn how to also help with the different healing processes, but there is order there. So he says there's purpose. And since there's purpose, that also means that there's functionality. There's a function with the purpose. We're going to learn more about that in studying this section. But, just looking at that purpose was not enough for me. I had to go find out, what do you mean by a time and a season? Okay? We oftentimes read it in English and say, yeah, I agree, and then I move on. And then you go back and you look it up in a Hebrew dictionary and you go, oh my gosh, there's so much more here. We need to take that time out and say, these key words here in that sentence, what is he talking about? And so, time and season. God has ordained a time and a season. Why? So that we would realize his master plan. It's all about his plan. He's got a purpose. And I told you previously when we studied Job that there's an angelic conflict going on right now. And when God created mankind, it was a part of the solution to the trial against the enemy. And we oftentimes forget that. We are part of the solution that God wants us to be witnesses of his mercy and grace. And so we see that there's a master plan, and the word time is referring to a point of time. It's an age. It's a dispensation. There are different ages that God has, different things taking place for his plan. So when it says there's a time for everything, it's talking about he's already set up a plan, a dispensation, a period of time when something's going to happen, and then things change to something else, and then change to something else, then change to something else. So he's got it already planned out. It's a plan. It's a reference to that. Well, what about season? Well, season is a reference to the distinguishing characteristics of that particular time period. There are certain things that happen that have a characteristic to it, and by understanding those characteristics, we can understand what period of time that is. And for God's plan, we can actually observe that plan in human history and see what he's doing. So when I first read this, there's a time and a season, and I heard, I listened to the birds sing the song, that is based off of Ecclesiastes 3. Let us think about that. What does he mean? Because most of us think, oh yeah, I know. Because when you read the next few verses, we're going to say, yeah, there's a time when we should have sorrow, and there's a time where we should cry. How does that fit back into God's plan? So we need to know that he's going to give us more information than just the obvious on the surface. And that's what I'm hoping you look for. You read the surface, you understand that, and you apply it to your life, and then you go deeper and say, okay, at a spiritual level, what's happening in these verses? And that's what I hope that we do this morning. So also, notice this. Solomon uses the word time 28 times to illustrate the truth of verse 1. So he's got verse 1, and then for 28 times he'll use the word time and give us some more insight. So I think that that's interesting. But also, it's important that we realize verses 2 through 8. We're going to go into verse 2 through 8. 2 through 8 is Hebrew poetry. Those verses are special. They're very special. Yeah, they make a great song for the birds. There's a time for everything. But Ecclesiastes 3, verses 2 through 8 is Hebrew poetry. It will list 28 groupings, couplets, two things together. 28. There'll be 28 events put into couplets of positive and negative. Each couplet is one positive and one negative, and it has a structure. This is a special type of Hebrew literature that has a structure that if we were to put letters next to it, you would say this is A, and it's a sentence, and it goes with B, and there's a sentence. And then there'd be a C sentence and a D sentence. And the A and B go together, the C and D go together, but then there's a parallelism that takes place. The A is in parallel to C, and the B is in parallel to D. And we will see that. I'll take us through our first one. It's that. That's what we talked about at the beginning of the whole class. I can't move that screen. Yeah, that's all right. So, yeah, I wish I could move it over because, for me, it's disturbing. All right. So, let me give a demonstration now. Let's go to Ecclesiastes 3, verses 2 and 3. So it says, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. So the poetry here, before we get into the details, but the poetry is such that the first line we'd call it A, second one we call it B, third one C, and the fourth one D. So a time to be born. The opposite of that is the time to die. Hebrew poetry has the positive and negative. And now a time to plant, and the opposite of that is the time to uproot or to harvest, or there's different words that we could use here. But notice the relationship. A time to born is the same as, or very similar in parallel to a time to plant. And the time to die is in parallel to the time to pluck up that which was planted. So this is a special type of Hebrew poetry that would make it, there's a rhythm to it. If you could read the Hebrew, there's a meter, because it's poetry. And there's also this parallelism that takes place. And it's an A, B, C, D. A, B, C, D. We're going to start seeing that pattern. All right. So I had a chart that I was going to use, but then I decided not to because it's huge and it goes in a lot more detail. It's more like if you took a course in Hebrew poetry. And I decided, no, our focus is not on Hebrew poetry as our class, but I loved it anyways for me. And if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I can add it to a handout next week. But Hebrew poetry is fascinating. And here's a case of it. Now, let's spend a little bit of time on that. What does it mean that there's a time to be born and a time to die? Why would he start off with that as the beginning of, remember the first verse was that there's a purpose for everything under the sun. Now he says, a time to be born and a time to die. What's his message here? Because this is the very first one he's starting with. There's a cycle. But you're not going to be born another time. You get born one time. But you're close. It's starting with a cycle, but a certain type of. God designs when you're born and when you die. You don't. It's out of your control. All right, now, man tries to control some of it because the dying part. They want to commit suicide, things like that. But we'll find out later, even all of that is inside of his master plan. He's sovereign over everything. So even though man has a will, you have a will to be involved in God's plan, but it's God's plan. He wants us to work, and we'll find it later in Ecclesiastes 3, he wants us to work along with his plan. But some of us may not, in which case we try to take control. And an example here, a time to be born. Some people try to take control over that. Mankind is getting closer and closer genetically to try to design the babies, trying to design, a child that doesn't have certain illnesses and all kinds of reasons that man says we can genetically do things. But at the same time, they cannot control life. There's a time that is out of our control, and that's the birth and the death. So that's the beginning of his talking about his observations. See, he's trying to prove now the observation that there's vanity. Everything's vanity. But he's starting off by observing the life cycle. As Katina was saying, there's a cycle here. But look, he says a time to plant and a time to pluck up what was planted. Why does he say that after saying the time to be born and time to die? Now he skips human life or animal life or whatever. He skips that and he goes to the plant life. What's he doing? Okay, planting something that we are, he's observing that we are in control in some aspects of it. Not in all of it. We can plant it, but it doesn't mean it's going to grow. Okay? So, even though it looks like man is going to have some power here, man has no power. Man can plant it, and then we just, God, will you please let it be a harvest? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Okay, but also there's the opposite side, the upplucking of it, the uprooting. All right? We know as an agricultural group in Israel is going to be very, very familiar with the planting and the harvesting cycle. Matter of fact, their entire calendar is based off of that. All right, the entire calendar is an agriculture calendar. Even though it's a religious calendar, God set it up because of the agriculture. Okay, there's a lot there. So he starts off with this: a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which was planted. All right, let's go to the verse 3. And verse 3 says, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. This is the last time I'll show you the A, B, C, D. I just want you to get the pattern. In the future, you'll do it on your own. But notice here, first we look at the pattern of poetry. A time to kill is opposite of the time to heal. Positive and negative. A time to break down, now he's flipping something. And a time to build it up. He's going to now add a little twist to his poetry and do the opposite. Do a negative with a positive. He's saying there's a time to break something down and a time to build it back up. This will get your attention if you're following the poetry. So he says a time to kill, a time to heal. Oh, there's a time to break down and a time to build up. In other words, the healing is like the build up. See how he's used that parallelism? And the killing is like the breaking down. So he's still trying to follow his pattern, but it had to be reversed for us because of the words he's using, the kill and the heal. All right. So interesting word here, though, is the word kill. Hebrew have different words for the word kill. And one word is a word that means you have violently killed. We call that murder. And that is the one that's in the commandments. The 6th commandment says, thou shalt not kill. It's actually the Hebrew word, thou shalt not commit violent murder. You shall not murder. But there's other times where the word kill is a word that we would talk about in self-defense. There's a time when you have to go to war to protect your country, your family. And the kill here is that word. It's all about a self-defense period. There's a time where you have to go and kill, even though you don't want to. So he's not talking about the murder kill. He says in God's plan, there is a time when killing is, he's got it in his plan. There's a time where you need to defend your freedoms. You need to defend your family. You need to fight against terrorism. You need to fight against Satan, the enemy. There's a time for that. But there's also a time when you heal. It's very similar in World War II. After the battles, we went into countries that were enemies of ours, and we tried to bring healing back into those countries. I got a friend. He's really one of my students, but I call him a friend. He is from Japan. And he was just telling me that in Japan, they still are thankful for MacArthur and how they brought in order and brought healing after the nation went through a destructive period of time. Now, of course, he's gone through a lot of American propaganda as well, because we really spent a lot of time trying to get them to agree with our way of life. So he's like the 4th generation, but I agree with him that yes, there was a time for healing, not a time to keep on fighting. Well, a time to break down, a time to build up. In our lives, there's a time in our life where God says we need to break something apart. It's like hard ground, like the heart is hardened, and we need to fallow it. We need to break it up. We need to get those calluses out there and soften things up. And there's a time to break things, which is the opposite of the time to kill. So it's in parallel, but also it can be used for something positive. Just like killing could be used for positive, even though we don't normally think of it that way. Breaking it down, but there's also a time where we need to build each other up. God has a plan for that. He has a plan at the larger scale. The larger scale is the angelic conflict. He's trying to build to a solution where there be harmony throughout the entire universe, not just human harmony. And he's also got a period of time where he says he's going to restore things back to the original plan. So there's an interesting thing here about a time to build up. Now, each of us in our own lives, we can look at this and say, yeah, I think I'm going through a season in life right now where it's a time for healing. I've gone through some things, and it's time that I focus on God healing. Or I need to be a healer. And as a professor, I have students that come and talk to me about some personal things that are only between us and the student, because they're looking for someone to help them with the healing that they need to go through. And so having wisdom about this, knowing that God has a plan, is much better than Solomon thinking it's all vanity. There's no plan. Okay? So he's trying to give us some observations here. Let's go through some more of Ecclesiastes 3. So next one, we have the verse 4. He says there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. All right, so I'd like to hear your comments now about a time to weep, a time to laugh, mourn, and dance. What do you think about that, those couplets?
I like how he put the hard part first, and then the good times.
Yeah, difficult, hard part first, good times.
To appreciate the good times.
All right, so with the hard times, difficult times, matching with the positive good times, you'll appreciate those good times better because you've already gone through that hard time. And if you go through the good time, you're preparing now for the hard time coming, because this is a cycle. Okay? As Katina pointed out earlier, there's a cycle in all of this. So there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. Go ahead, Denise.
What I'm seeing is maybe this is like relating to his learning experience, because everything that he's doing, he's weeping and then he's laughing because he's able to overcome that weeping.
All right.
Same with the morning and able to find joy again.
All right, so she's applying this to how, teaching children about life, and how there's a time of weeping, and there's times for the laughter and building that up. There's times when we mourn, and when you teach a child about that, because they sometimes don't understand what they're feeling, what they're going through, and adults also. And then a time for the dance. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yes?
I think it's interesting if you think about the biblical culture of mourning. The weeping and laughing is kind of a physical reaction. The mourning and dancing is the outward, what you do.
All right.
in that situation.
Excellent analysis. So she's saying that the weeping and the laughter part is that internal part that outwardly is expressed through the mourning or through the dancing, which is true. The weeping, oftentimes that emotional state is inside and is shown through a mourning or through crying. It would be highly unusual to go to a funeral and someone is laughing hysterically. You're like, wow, what's wrong with that person? Because it doesn't fit in to the time for something. Or if you go to a period of someone is celebrating a wedding and someone over there is just crying their eyes out, and you're like, what's wrong? Because it's obviously not a happiness crying. Could you imagine the groom just bawling and the bride is so happy she's dancing? See, it would be kind of, you'd be wondering, what's going on, right? Did the father have a shotgun? The father of the bride has a shotgun and that groom is just crying? No. But the point is that there are things that are definitely appropriate, and yet, we're kind of like, okay, what's happening here with this time to weep, time to laugh, time to mourn, time to dance? Now, what's interesting here is I did a little bit of study. I'm at a Southern Baptist church, so I did a little bit of study on the word dance. Okay? And I teach at a Church of Christ university. All right? They don't have dancing there either. All right? But they are dancing. There is dancing. So what's this about? And when you go in the Bible, the most outrageous dancer ever in the Bible is King David. King David. He's returning the Ark of the Covenant back to, bringing it to Jerusalem. And he's out there dancing in his ephod. You know what that is? He's wearing his panties, his underwear. He's almost completely naked. His wife is watching out the window in the palace, And she sees this fool coming down the street, and he's the king. And he's just wild about his dancing. It says he was leaping, twirling. Twirling? Yeah, that means the ephod is exposing things. And she says, you're doing it in front of your handmaidens. You know, this is embarrassing. So when he comes inside, she starts to chew him out. She stops him. He stops her. He stops her right immediately. It says, it was before the Lord. It has nothing to do with sensuality. Had nothing to do with trying to bring attention to myself. And has nothing to do with you, woman. This has to do with dancing before the Lord with joy. And so we get an image there. We should not be dancing that exposes us, but there is a form of ritual dancing that's a celebration, and it's usually done in a group. A couple, two people dancing together is not what this is referring to. This is not talking about a time to dance when you go to the high school or college dance and you dance with another person. It's talking about the celebration of God's kingdom and dancing. It's a religious ritual dance. If you've been to any of the Jewish celebrations, you'll see how they celebrate, and they do it in groups. Sometimes, a group of men over here dancing, a group of women over here dancing. Sometimes there's a mixture, but never is it sensual. It's always a celebration unto the Lord of some happiness that God's brought into their lives. Yes?
I think Fiddler on the Roof is a perfect example.
Oh, thank you. So if you have not seen the Fiddler on the Roof, you should go watch that, because it's a perfect example of that kind of celebration and that happiness. All right. Well, let's move on to verses 5 and 6. All right. Ecclesiastes 5 and 6 says there's a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Okay, so we're going to deal with that first group before we get to 6. A time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones. I got to tell you the truth. I read 15 commentaries. 15 commentaries, and all of them don't know what this is talking about. They speculate. I think 3 of them got it right. Because I look at the poetry, the A, B, C, D. Okay, so a time to cast away has got to go with that time to embrace. A time to gather stones has got to go with the time to refrain from embracing. Well, the embracing here has to do with a man and woman loving each other. Embracing is an act of sex. All right? So the 2 above, the commentators that related it back said these are related also to sexuality. They said they were euphemisms. A euphemism is a word that you would use that talks about another word that you don't want to use in mixed company. It's a euphemism. So the casting of stones could be the lovemaking and the impregnating, and then the gathering stones together could be you're refraining now. You're keeping yourself refrained. So I don't know if that's true or not. Another idea the commentators had was the following. When you go to battle, you would throw stones out into the fields of your enemy so they cannot have food. And then there's a time for gathering stones where in that same area you might now pull those stones together and build a building and stuff like that. There's different ways of interpreting that particular verse. Number 5 is the hardest one to understand. All the rest are very easy. But number 5 really gets people confused. And I'll just let you know, I don't know what it means. And in your own studies, if you come back next week and get some more information, feel free to share it with us. But notice here, it says that there is a time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing, even if we're not talking about the man-wife relationship. If we're just talking about each other, there are times when it's perfectly normal to embrace somebody else and welcome them and say, I'm so happy to see you again. And there's other times where, no, you shouldn't do it. It's not the appropriate time. So there's different times for that. A time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to cast away. What do you think about that? Time to seek, a time to lose. Have you ever had something that's really, really important to you and you lost it? And have you spent lots of time seeking something? And so there is a time when you are really trying to find something, and then there's other times where, okay, it's time to put it in the garage sale and get rid of it. I got to go lose it, okay? I've got some things that I've gathered for years that have no more meaning to life. It's time to get rid of it.
Kind of like when people are building up a home, their family, and then they're downsizing.
All right, so it's like building up the home, the family, and then there comes a time where you guys say, okay, cut the loss there. we're not gonna keep that anymore. That little toy that you had when you were 2, you don't need now at 23. Anyways, all right. So there's a lot of other meanings here. We could spend quite a bit of time on this. There's a time to seek something because God says if you seek, you will find. So there are scriptural bases for doing it. There are times where God says rest. Like time to lose. You're going to back off, relax about it, and just let it go. That job was not for me. I'm not going to go after it. So, there's different ways of applying this. Just try and give you insight there. All right. So, 7 and 8. A time to tear and a time to sow. You quilters out there probably understand that one. Yep. Matter of fact, I was thinking when I read that last night, I started laughing. I had this imagination that there was a bunch of quilters and seamstresses who are employed to do all the sewing because you keep on ripping everything, people are going through misery. In that culture, if something really bad happens, they rip their clothes, they rip their robes. Gotta have someone that sews it back together. So anyways, I saw that and I said, yeah.
Did they have scissors back at that time? Seriously?
They did not use scissors, but they had blades that they.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, 'cause didn't they just cut it apart and then tear the fabric to make it come on the string right?
Yeah, I don't know how they did it because I have not studied anything to do with sewing. My wife will tell you he's not touching my quilts. Actually, in high school, I did take a class. It's related to the subject, but off subject. I took a class in high school just to be with the girls. I was the only guy in the sewing class. And so my teacher says, what are you going to sew, Curtis? Because she wasn't sure if she wanted me in her class. What are you going to sew? I said, I'm going to make myself a cooking apron. Yeah, a cooking apron. And she goes, okay, we'll let you in class. So I made this cooking apron that was awesome, and my dad, he basically took it from me and he used it for multiple summers outdoors cooking. All right. So I also took the cooking class because I was the only guy in that. So home ec was my favorite subject for at least a whole year, my junior year. All right. So it says here, there is a time to be silent and there is a time to speak. Unfortunately, many of us don't know the difference.
It's taken me 60 years.
So, there's a time to keep silent. And for example, in Job, he's going through misery. His friends get there. They spend 7 days and 7 nights not speaking. That's the appropriate behavior. You don't know what to say to somebody who's just totally emotionally or physically demolished. Just being there, not even saying a word, can bring the healing that we. So there's a time to be silent, but there's also a time to speak.
It's kind of an opposite of what there is, because it's silent first and then you're speaking.
Yeah. So the tearing and the silence, the sowing and the speaking. So as you spend more time thinking about these, remember the A, B, C, D, and see what kind of other things God can show you out of the pattern. So there's a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. We have a flip-flop there. We have a love and war, hate, and peace. Now there's a reason for that. This is the 8th verse. This is the last verse in the poetry. And so it wants to harmonize with something positive at the end. So at the end, it's going to put the peace part. It's going to flip-flop it. it summarizes the whole poem.
So aren't we called to forgive, though? That's a hard verse to accept, that there's a time to hate if we're called to forgive.
Yeah. So the question is, or the statement also, is that very difficult. Verse 8 says there's a time to love, and we got that. But a time to hate? I don't know. Well, yes, God has a plan and purpose for when hate is appropriate. For example, do you know that God says that he chose between two twin brothers? One of them he loved, the other one he hated. Hate is a word that God uses to show disapproval, not the way that humans use it emotionally. It's not a term of you're going to kill somebody. He says he hated Esau and loved. Who did he love? Jacob. So it's interesting because who was the trickster? Yeah, Jacob, you know. But yet Jacob had a heart toward God, and Jacob rebounded or repented often. Okay. And Esau was focused on himself and his life, and he did not focus on God. So that's one example of the word hate. It's a word that is hard for us because we should not have inside of us a hatred for a person, but the scriptures makes it very clear that we should hate the deeds of the enemy. When Satan is doing stuff, we should hate that. And oftentimes Christians in America tolerate it. They don't voice that they're hating something when we know it's from the enemy. So, but it says here that there's a time for war. We talked about earlier also about the killing and the healing, and a time for peace. And this peace here is the cessation of againstness. Means that when someone's against somebody else, it's time for that to stop. And that's what it's referring to. The peace. And so this poetry, you can spend quite a bit of time reading, meditating on it. It's very short, 2 through 8. Verses 2 through 8 is a poem. And if you remember that they're in couplets, it can give you some more insight to how to apply it to your own life. But let's see, do we have enough time to move on? We got another 15 minutes, right? All right, let's go on.
First, let's make a comment. Before we move on, I think it's interesting to look at these contrasts. Show off each and every other
Yeah.
passage. You look at marriage, you look at close relationships you have, you look at business relationships, ministry relationships. There's always differences of opinion, which could lead to the two extremes that show up in each one of these passages. And the question in those relationships is, how do you talk that out, pray about it, seek the Lord's wisdom, and come to God's wisdom on, is it time to love, or is it time to go to war, or time to make peace?
Very good.
Just see these things jump off the page for me as I look at our marriage. And how often we were overseas a couple weeks ago, and we got involved in a situation where I was ready to go to war. And Pam was like, no, it's time to make peace. And it took her a better part of the day to talk me down off the ledge to be at peace
Yeah.
where we were. And just how often that comes in, I think it's seeking God's wisdom instead of our own wisdom to try to get to what the right answer is here.
Very good. So he's sharing, if you didn't hear all of it, and I want to make sure we get it on the call here, or the recording, is that in our lives, in marriage, in business, in different situations that we're involved in, we have sometimes these two extremes. We can have one reaction or the other reaction. He talked about a situation where he's ready to go to war, and the wife is saying, let's bring it to peace, whatever that situation was. And it took some time to seek out God's wisdom. What does God want you to do? Because it's God's timing. This whole thing, this whole poetry is about the plan of God, and he's got a perfect plan. And the observation being made by Solomon here is that there's a time for each of these. Be seeking God about what the time is. Is it the right time to heal or the time to kill, etc.? So it's an important factor to use that in every part of your life. And for the college kids that are here, it's all about, or the postgraduate and the undergrad, it's all about, am I doing right now in this dichotomy of these two different things that are coming up? Is it my time now to make friends or not? Is it my time now to keep silent or to speak up? So there's things that each of us, God will prompt us. And it's very important that we go back to 1 John 1:9, that we're in fellowship. We confess our sins, we're ready to hear him. So that when he does speak to us, we're able to act on it. Because if you're not in fellowship, and you're like David, Solomon is in Ecclesiastes, he's all over the place, and he's destroying lots of things. And we'll see that further on as we go further. So let me see if we can get a few more minutes in. So what we have now is Ecclesiastes 9 through 11. We're no longer in the poetry. We're now in the narrative. And it's interesting because it starts off with, what gain has the worker from his toil? We saw that question at the very beginning. He's repeating the question. In the beginning, before he starts his experiments, he says, what good is it that I do all this work? Because it's all vanity. He's now asking a question about those observations. Related back to that poetry. There's an observation here. What gain has the worker from his toils? And then he says, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he's put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. There's a lot in there. Let's see if we can take some of it apart. So, first of all, look within. Eternity is in the heart. So notice here, the teacher is adjusting. He's no longer just going along with his experiments and his empirical touching, tasting, feeling, everything. He's now trying to adjust his sights, and he's starting to look at something under the sun that's different from what he had before. And you'll notice here he did repeat the opening question that we got out of 1:3, that all this, is it really worth it? And so we find the following. Yeah, I have it as one full page. There's a lot up there. So the natural man, that's the person who is not, they don't know God. They're natural. They're not spiritual. The natural man. All around us, in our community, everywhere, there's good intentions. They work hard, and they are trying to straighten out the moral irregularities of this world. They labor real hard, but Solomon tells us even all that work for good, even though you have good intentions, it's all vanity. One, you do it either because of selfish reasons you perform it, or two, you're not doing it in the right timing of God. Two things that cause the vanity. That's what those verses we were just talking about. And it says that God placed into our hearts this idea, this concept, this thing that he calls eternity in our hearts. Eternity in our hearts. There is a reason why everybody is seeking happiness and some pleasure and something good, because they're trying to feel this idea of eternity that's in their hearts. But God only feels it one way, by us seeking him, when we go to him. So there are limitations. No matter how hard you try, let me back it up to that verse. Let's see if I can back it up. So down here, yet he has put eternity into their heart, into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Frustration. I'm seeking this eternity, and even though I'm seeking it, I'm frustrated because I can't figure out what God's doing. From the beginning to the end. I don't know everything God knows. And so there's this feeling of, even when you become a believer, it's like, okay, God, tell me what's going on. And he's like, a little bit at a time, child. A little bit at a time. You wouldn't be able to handle all of it at once. I kind of got this picture of kind of like a capacitor inside of a system that gets fully charged, and then it explodes if you give it too much. You know, we would explode if we got too much. All right. So God has a perfect timing for us. And it also drives us to him. And that's what the verse is talking about. So let's go forward again. So it says, God placed this desire in man that they might know our own limitations, that we might know our own limitations and drive us to God. That's what's going on in that verse, in verse 11. All right, so let's go on to 12. There we go. So 12 says, I, Solomon, the teacher, perceived that there is nothing better for them, those who have nothing in life but just to live. They don't have any purpose in life. So I have perceived for them to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toils, and this is God's gift to them. In other words, if you don't know the Lord at all, you don't really have much to live for, except for the pleasures of that day. And God says, go ahead, enjoy the pleasures of that day, but make sure that you recognize it's a gift from God. Even that is a gift from God. We, in theology, we say that God has grace that's given to the whole world. They all have food and air and so on. There's a general grace given, and then there's a special grace given to us for those who get born again. Well, same thing happens here. All these people who are toiling through life, he says, take pleasure in that. So that's the conclusion. The conclusion here, Solomon concludes, the natural man's best course, that is the person who doesn't know God, the natural man's best course is to live his life enjoying the fruits of his labor, because basically that's all he has. And then also, the second part of that conclusion is he should realize that his ability to enjoy the fruits of the labor is a gift from God, and hopefully it will drive them, the goodness of God will drive them to repent and to come to know the giver of the gifts. And so that's the conclusion that Solomon comes to there. But we got 2 more verses to end. I know we're out of time, but I'm going to do it anyways. All right. Ecclesiastes 14 and 15. And I, the teacher, perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people will fear before him. They have reverence to God. And that which is already has been. And that which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. There's a lot there, but we'll take a moment to talk about it. So first of all, he says, life appears to be transitory. Whatever God does, though, is forever. It's eternal. So therefore, when we live for him, we live with life having meaning, and it's eternal. We live for ourselves, it's transitory. It's a vapor. Instead of complaining about what we don't have, let's enjoy what we do have and thank God for it, and let the good drive us to fear or reverence God, as he's the sovereign author of all these moments in history that we oftentimes forget. God is in charge. He's sovereign. And cease from your own labors and cooperate with him in his labor, is the ending there in verse 14 and 15. All right. Any questions? There's a lot there. We went over time, but I hope that you can go home now for this whole week and meditate on that poem and ask God, what more in here do you want me to apply to my life? Father, I pray that you would continue your work in our spirit, in our souls, our minds and hearts, and help us, God, to be able to align with your labor, that we would do your work and further the kingdom. In Jesus' name, amen.